Every year, more people get into retro video game collecting, and often with this increased demand, video game prices go up year after year. Whether if it's someone buying a game they played when they were younger, or someone looking to experience a classic for the first time, there's an ever-growing demand for retro games. Over time, companies have noticed that demand and found a way to meet buyers where they're at. Nintendo, with their long lineage of well-crafted games, probably has the greatest reason to find ways to make money off their past games, and has done so in a few ways. Nintendo has repackaged games into collections for gamers to play old games on new consoles, sold digital versions of old games, and most recently has created a subscription service to access hundreds of games across multiple different consoles. But I want to take a look at the cheapest way Nintendo has ever re-released their games, the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, or SNES Classic. The SNES Classic is a plug-and-play console modeled to be a replica of their Super Nintendo, which released in 1990. This Classic Edition features a smaller replica, 2 controllers, and an installed 21 of their best games released on the Super Nintendo. Well, really 20 games, as the 21st game was a never-before-released sequel to Star Fox, which was canned at the last minute, but that's a story for another time. This Classic Edition was announced in June 2017, and then released on September 29, 2017. The SNES Classic was preceded in 2016 by the NES Classic, which did the same thing the SNES Classic does to the Super Nintendo, but for the original Nintendo Entertainment System. A handful of the games on the SNES Classic were some of the rarest and most expensive games on the resale market. I want to see the extent the SNES Classic had on the resale market. By looking at the prices for these games on PriceCharting.com, a tool used by retro game stores to track going rates for retro games and other collectibles, I established multiple points in time that I felt were important. 1 year before the SNES Classic was announced, 1 month before the SNES Classic was announced, when the SNES Classic was announced, the months in between the announcement and the release, the 6 months after the release, every September after the Classic was released, March 2020, and then the month I'm making this, November 2023. These points in time were significant for things like the pandemic starting. Looking at this chart, it's interesting to see the dip in prices between 2018 and 2019, right before March 2020, where everything increases. After looking at the data, I think it's plain to see that the SNES Classic did affect the prices of the physical counterparts of games featured, resulting in lower prices for all but 4 of the games featured on the re-release console. I want to establish how the games did from September 2017 to November 2023, and September 2017 to March 2020. And I also wanted to see a sample size of games not released on the SNES Classic, and how they compare to the games released on the SNES Classic in the same time periods. On average, between the 20 games released on the SNES Classic, the price grew 21.57% from September 2017 to November 2023, while the games in the sample grew 37.07%. But I found this to be less interesting. The increase in demand during the pandemic made prices change completely. So how did prices look up to March 2020? By looking at this time period, I believe that we can see the true effect the SNES Classic had on the resale market. From September 2017 to March 2020, SNES Classic games had their price drop 15.80%, while non-SNES Classic games had their price drop 1.27%. The SNES Classic dramatically decreased the price of the included game's physical counterparts, while games not featured did not experience quite the benefit. What games benefited the most in the September to March timeframe? The price of Star Fox had dropped 37.52%, but 4 games still experienced a price increase during this time. F-Zero's price grew 17.70%, Earthbound's price grew 0.61%, Super Mario Kart grew 8.80%, and Donkey Kong Country's price grew 4.77%. With every other game's price on the SNES Classic dropping at least 8.34%. Over all 40 games I looked at, from September 2017 to March 2020, the average price decrease was 8.54%. I find it interesting to see that video game prices were stagnating around 2018 and 2019. That only changed in March 2020 when prices started to go up. With people stuck at home, more people were wanting to play games, so only natural that prices would go up. Since March 2020, retro video game prices have hit the highest of highs they ever have, with prices only going down as recent of September, October, and November 2023. And while the games featured on the Super Nintendo Classic did have their price increase less from March 2020, I find it interesting that from March 2020 to November 2023, the games that were featured on the SNES Classic had their price increase 45.37%, and the games sampled at the same time only had their price increase 39.81% on average. But from the release of the Super Nintendo Classic to November 2023, the games on the SNES Classic had their price only increased 21.57% overall. Well, on average, the games I sampled increased 37.07% over that same time period. It seems that up until the pandemic, the Super Nintendo Classic games had their demand significantly decrease. After looking at the data, I think it's plain to see that online services like Nintendo Switch Online and releases like the Super Nintendo Classic have contributed to less demand for the physical cartridges of these games. But all that work was undone when the pandemic increased demand for video games. If in March 2020, the pandemic did not increase demand for retro games, I believe that prices would have stayed low, and we'd see a longer effect of the SNES Classic on the market. I think it's important to note that in 2019, the Super Nintendo was added to the Nintendo Switch Online service, which allows subscribers to play select SNES games on their Nintendo Switch, which also had an effect on the price of these games. In the future, I plan to see how getting added to the Nintendo Switch Online service affects a game's physical price, and also to see if the NES Classic and other digital re-releases, like the PlayStation and Genesis re-releases, have had a similar effect on the market like the SNES Classic did. Ever since the release of these digital consoles in 2016 and 2017, I've always wondered if they would truly affect the prices of games, and I'm glad I finally know the answer. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe for more about video game preservation. Thanks for watching.